Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and I'm back in touch with my friend William Fletcher again. He's been showing up on these talk shows a number of times, along with his co author, Craig Smith. They have a book whose title you can infer from looking at the background behind him. It's called Reaching Net Zero, the cover of the book. And we're going to talk today about whether or not it's possible for renewables to power the world. Lord knows the amount of energy that human beings are requiring grows every year. And some types of energy we certainly want to get away from, certainly fossil fuels, and from my point of view, nuclear as well. And I think Bill would largely agree with me on that. The question, though, is when and how and whether that's going to be possible. Can we get along with the kinds of power sources that we can put together in the next few years? Hello, Bill Fletcher.
Hi, pleasure to be with you again.
It's always fun to talk to you. And This is such an important question today. And I don't know what your answer is, although I can probably guess that you wouldn't have shown up here if you didn't think you could defend one point of view.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's hope we're on the same page.
We probably are. Yeah.
All right. What makes you think then that renewables can power the world? And by the way, what's a renewable? I mean, maybe we don't even necessarily agree on what we are talking about.
Well, I think that the most common definition would be energy that does not release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And if that's your definition, it comes down to, obviously the traditional one would be hydro, using dams like the Hoover Dam, very good source of power. A country like Norway gets almost all of their power from hydro, and that would be a big one, but there's a very limited quantity of hydro available. It's not available, obviously, everywhere. You need mountains with lots of water. The other would be geothermal. That's been pioneered in California and other locations. Again, non-carbon source of energy.
When we say the word renewable, it means that you can keep on producing more of it in more or less indefinitely. That's true for forests, for example. You can grow more trees if you're dependent on wood. But some of the things that you've already called renewable, I'm wondering if they really are. For example, the waters of some of the rivers in Asia are fed by melting glaciers. Yes. And if the global warming increases too much in the glaciers melt, they're not going to be those rivers, or at least there's not much there. Yeah. So would you even call those renewable in that case? For example, dams built on rivers like that.
Well, I think we could say that in the past, dams have been renewable because you could count every season. There'd be a buildup of snow and ice in the mountains, and that would melt, and then there'd be water flowing down rivers into reservoirs that would power water. And a great example is the Hoover Dam. I mean, if you go there now, the reservoir is less than 50% full, just because, partly because of river flow, but I think more because of population growth taking more water out of the river. So I would say that hydro was a renewable source. And the other thing is its potential is limited. So even if it's very good, you can't build much more of it, and you can't build it where it's needed. And also, it's very expensive. Dams are very expensive to build,
and they often ruin good land.
They can, yeah. I mean, you do have to obviously take up a lot of land area, but that's true of most energy sources. So I think, when you get down to renewables, and we can come back to nuclear and discuss whether that is or isn't, But the biggies are solar and wind, and in a way, wind is also solar. I mean, it depends on the differential heating of the Earth to create the wind in the first place. So let's say solar and wind are all sources of basically using sunlight to produce electricity, if you want to use that as a term. And we can say, Craig and I have done a lot of calculations for our book and so forth, but the Earth receives a tremendous amount of energy from the sun every day. And I think the number we have, and I'd have to look it up, is that, in one day, the Earth receives enough energy to power the Earth for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
So solar energy is very abundant. One of the problems is it is not as steady as you would like, and it's not as even. Some places get more than others. So when we talk about powering the Earth with renewables, there is a role for hydro, geothermal, even nuclear. But the big thing is we would be using solar and wind as the main source of energy. And we could also throw in biofuels, but we tend to not put a lot of weight on those, and the forecasts we see do not put a lot of weight on biofuels, because basically in most cases you're competing with farmland. And
well, I guess my guess is that your answer, yes or no, is going to be, well, it depends. That is, if we're talking about when, the kinds of technologies that are available now are not necessarily the only ones that will be available 50 years from now. If we have to talk about fusion, for example, fusion energy, or maybe geothermal, where they're really, really going to get deep boreholes into toward the center of the Earth to get a lot of the heat that way. That I don't think that technology is all that developed now, but maybe in 20, 30, 40 years it'll be more so. But I would think also that it depends on where you're talking about, because people in the Arctic are not going to have the sunshine, the amount of sunshine that's available in other, tropics, for example. And I would imagine that it'd be harder to harvest enough energy there, especially in the winter when it's dark, to get along. Tell me about that. How much variation is there by region?
Well, I mean, let's. I mean, there's a number of things we could talk about, but first of all, solar and wind. Let me just make one point. I mean, 30 years ago, it would have been theoretically possible to produce enough wind turbines and solar panels, let's say, to power the world. However, it'd be prohibitively expensive. What's happened in the last 30 years, the cost of solar panels and wind turbines has dropped dramatically. They've gotten much better, and they've gotten much, much cheaper. And that, especially for solar, the cost trend is continuing because of economies of scale. You use more, you find that you can build bigger, more automated factories, for instance. So where we are now is that solar and wind are the most inexpensive source of electricity, or becoming. I mean, that's not true in every single location. So the cost is a big breakthrough. Solar and wind are cheaper, and what we're also seeing now is battery technology, because of increasing demand for electric vehicles and for utility scale power. That's also showing dramatic improvements without any major technological breakthrough. There are some R&D for new battery technology, but it's mainly talking about reducing the cost of existing technology.
Well, isn't that still the big bottleneck? That once you get really good transmission lines so that you could share power from one part of the world where it's abundant to another part where it's hard, for example, the Arctic maybe, that would be important. But batteries also, if they're really, really cheap, would make all the difference in the world.
Well, before we forget, let's go back to the Arctic you asked
Yeah.
about. Well, the Arctic, during parts of the year, half of the year, they get a lot of sunlight, first of all. And then they have a lot of wind. And so, you don't, I mean, you're not going to put a big wind farm in Vermont, let's say. But
Why not?
huh?
Why
What?
not? Vermont doesn't have any wind, but no.
Well,
But
I mean, I meant solar because
oh,
of the climate. But right now, today, we do, all areas of the world are not energy independent. I mean, New York City or Chicago or pick a state, they don't produce their own energy. They get energy from the Middle East. They get it from Texas. They get coal from Montana. A big part of the fossil fuel industry is transportation. We drill for oil in the North Sea and in the remote parts of Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and we transport oil all over the world to be refined and consumed. I mean, the gasoline you put in your car could have come halfway around the world. And I think that with solar, people tend to think, well, gee, we can't put all those solar panels in our neighborhood, let's say, or in our state, but there'll be states and countries that have abundant energy, and there'll be others that have a lot less, and we need transmission lines and other means to transport the energy, just like we do today. Maybe the Sahara Desert will become the new Saudi Arabia. We would have giant solar farms there. And there is one I've read about in Tunisia where they're actually going to have a cable go under the Mediterranean to bring electric power to Europe from North Africa. So I think we need to think bigger than we are and not think about rooftop solar and things like that.
Is there anything wrong with rooftop solar? It makes people a little more independent because I don't like everything being centralized, so that if something happens to the grid, for example, we're all sunk. The whole half of North America is sunk. So I like the idea that, I mean, I live in a high rise where there's no place for me to put a solar panel, but I like the idea that people could have their own energy source. And this can, even politically, it's good to know that you can be more independent.
Well, I mean, I would disagree with that. I've got friends, living in Southern California. Several of them have rooftop solar, and Craig has rooftop solar. He's had it for 15 years. There just isn't enough area on our rooftops. I mean, I'm not against rooftop solar, especially for things like parking lots and big buildings. But if you look at just the area available, it will only supply a small amount, and then you don't have a generator in your backyard to produce your electricity today using fossil fuels. It's much cheaper and more reliable to have big power plants and have transmission and distribution systems that have redundancy, things like that. If everybody had a diesel generator in their backyard, there'd be a terrific noise and pollution problem. So I think rooftop solar is a great idea. But then if you want it to be reliable, you need to invest a lot of money in storage because, and that, so I think you would probably find that if you really wanted to be grid independent, it would be very expensive. And for most people, why bother? If you can get reliable, renewable energy like California is promoting from the grid, you don't need rooftop. Or if you want it, it's a little bit of it's a vanity in a way. People want to charge their electric vehicles. But rooftop is not the solution. It's a commendable thing that can help, but it's
okay.
Yeah. but I mean, we need to there's a couple of problems we need to solve. I mean, the energy is available. and we can now, it's cost effective to produce clean electricity from wind and solar in a quantity that needed to power the world. Then you need to have the distribution system, just like you have for fossil fuels today, only you'll be distributing electricity to get it around. One other thing, and I'll just throw this out, we can discuss it now or later, is the intermittent nature of renewables. That's a fact. It's not like a nuclear power plant or even a gas-fired or coal-fired plant where you can turn it on and run it. So you do have to accommodate variability, but that gets easier if you spread it out over long distances. If we have a national transmission backbone, so we can use power that's produced, let's say, in Texas during the heat of the day, and
yeah, it's the other way around. If you remember what happened a couple of weeks ago, it was Texas could use power that's produced elsewhere, and they needed it but couldn't get it because they were too independent. So I have to provide you with an argument against the I was defending a bit ago. You win that one.
Yeah, but I mean, Texas is an example where they should have had some interstate connection. But the other thing that's coming out is that most of the failure was they had a nuclear plant and several coal and gas fired plants go offline. And they had a storm in 2011 that was where they had they had problems. They weren't quite as severe as these. And they came up with a bunch of recommendations to strengthen their grid, and they didn't do it. When we talk about wind and solar or electricity in general, grid reliability is a big deal. And if we don't invest in that, we're going to have problems like that. California had it. We had blackouts during the wildfires, and you need redundancy. You need more than two paths to get electricity to your home.
So when the wildfires were happening, how is that a reflection on the inability or the unwillingness of California to spend in upgrading its system? Was that I thought it was caused by the wildfires, but it was also caused by PG&E's negligence or something?
Well, I mean, you can argue a bunch of things, but some of the wildfires were caused by failure of the transmission lines and transformers. And it turned out that these were 100-year-old transmission lines, and they had been poorly maintained. And so I think you need to keep things modern and up to date. Maybe, and then they had to shut down power because of the fire risk. They had to shut down certain transmission lines, and they had no backup. They had no alternative way to get power to certain towns because they only had one route. If you think about grid redundancy, you do need more than one route to get, let's say, to get power to your house. You need to make sure that that those lines are not vulnerable to weather extremes and things like that. In California, we should worry a little bit about earthquake hardening, so that we don't lose electrical power if there's an earthquake. But these are all engineering problems. They're not showstoppers.
But yes, I guess because I'm a political sociologist, the thing that always occurs to me is I'm interested in the way that the location of certain resources affects international politics. So, for example, when we have a war and the students are in the streets saying "No blood for oil," what they're saying is that we are fighting wars that we wouldn't have to fight if we weren't so dependent on a particular other country and have to have a relationship with it because it has the oil that we need, et cetera. So the location of the oil and the location of the need for the consumer means that there's a big political effect. And when I said that, centralization of power means let's say you have this thing in the Sahara or Tunisia, where you're going to put it, and Europe is going to be fueled by this, solar system in Tunisia. This is going to change the political relationship, the power structure of the relationship between Tunisia and a bunch of other countries, right? Or
I mean, let's look at that today. I mean, first of all, you're not going to get all of your power from the Sahara Desert. I mean, and just like investing, I mean, the first rule of investing is diversify, have more than one, don't put all your stocks in one company, for instance. And even today, Germany and parts of Europe are very dependent upon natural gas from Russia. So I'd rather be, and the other thing is energy is just one more commodity that's traded around the world. So
yeah,
yes, you can say blood for oil, but world trade on average is very good. And if you were able to get some of your power, let's say from the Sahara, you're also creating jobs in a place where there's very little potential for economic development. So
no, I mean, all of these are dynamic.
yeah,
I'm not saying,
yeah,
I don't think it's
yeah.
an argument for renewables or against renewables. It's just that every system, once you have a big location of a source of power, you have the potential, for example, for dictatorship. There is a huge connection between countries that have oil and dictatorship,
Oh, sure.
because you can get hold of this thing and you've got a lot of money there.
Well,
But now, one of the, for
disaster
example,
sometimes.
when the
Yeah.
U.S. got into the fracking business 10 years or so, 15 ago, then it changed the dynamics with some of the other oil producing countries of the world, because the U.S. was not quite as dependent on these countries. In fact, it was exporting oil. So,
Yeah.
that kind of thing interests me. And but it's certainly not an engineering problem. It's a political problem. And I'm throwing you off track. Go back to
Yeah,
work.
but I mean,
Let me get off the subject.
let's go back and summarize just a couple of things. I mean, first of all, there's more than enough solar and wind power to provide all the world's energy. The other thing is, it's now the economics are such that is financially practical. In fact, if you worry about the future of nuclear, it's probably not going to be competitive with the cost of electricity from renewables not everywhere, but in most locations.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be done. There are problems to be solved, just like there is with oil and gas. I mean, Germany doesn't have its own gas supply. It gets a lot of gas from Russia. Other countries get oil from the Middle East and may have to transport it halfway around the world, like Japan. So these are all problems that were solved with fossil fuels and can be solved with renewables. And the renewables do have some unique problems, like the variable nature of wind and solar. And so energy storage, that comes back to energy storage. If you can store enough energy when the sun is shining, let's say, and when the wind is blowing strongly, if you can store that energy that for times when it isn't happening, or is a lot less, then you don't need nuclear and things like that. But today we don't need energy storage, because you can just turn a gas or oil fired, a gas or coal fired power plant on or off or up or down as you need it. But that is not going to be the way. Now, one other thing I think we should also talk about, we treat our electricity demand as fixed. I mean, when you want to be able to turn on the lights and assume electricity is going to be there, but we can also vary the demand as well. We could have certain electrical loads that are shed when power is down. We could vary the price of electricity depending on time of day, so that it's cheaper, let's say at midday, than in the evening. And if that was the case, some people might set their clothes dryers to work around noon and not at night. So there's a lot of things we could do
Wouldn't it be
to.
better to do it at night than in noontime? Isn't there more demand in the daytime than that at noon?
But there'd be more solar available if you wanted to think of it that way.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of it differently.
Yeah.
I was thinking of it with the situation now with the hydropower or other sources of power. For example, I mean, I did a talk show with a guy named Art Hunter in Ottawa who has lived, I think he said 10 months off the grid. He has fixed his entire household up so that everything is either renewable or he even gets power out of his backyard. I mean, there's some cables under there where he gets power and things like that. So he showed the camera was in the basement of his house where you see all these gadgets, which he's described. But of course, he was explaining how he times things like when he's going to do the dryer for certain times of day and so on. It seemed to me it would require a lot more attentiveness on things like scheduling than I would be willing to pay. But I think it was kind of a hobby for him. He didn't succeed. He didn't plan to succeed to do it year round. He said that Ottawa, there are a couple of months of the year that he knew he couldn't do it. So his goal in setting up the off the grid house was to make it possible to get along for 10 months. And then he would have to depend on the grid to some extent for the winter months for the heating and so on.
Well, and let's say what he's doing is commendable, but I'm sure he's not making his own gasoline. So, so he's not, right. but I mean, that may be.
But he's not using gasoline.
Yeah.
He's not using any. He doesn't have a car that uses gasoline, and everything in his household is from renewables.
But that is not a solution for the world. I mean, everybody can't do that. And, something like 60% of the world's population is urban. And I would say, and I just read Bill Gates' new book on climate change as well.
Yeah, you're going to review it for Peace Magazine, bless your heart.
Right, I am. I've already drafted it. In fact, I'll send it to you. Anyway, Craig and I believe that energy austerity is not the solution. I mean, and Bill Gates makes a very strong point that most of the world needs more energy, like Africa. They need lighting, they need air conditioning, they need transportation. So, and we feel that we need to be able to provide more energy using renewables. It needs to be reliable and it needs to be affordable. And we don't think austerity is not the solution. And much of the world is poor because of a lack of energy. There's a lot of places that need lighting, they need air conditioning, they need clean water, which would require power to, for purification and things like that. So,
let me tell you one of the kinds of dilemmas that people who are concerned about austerity, let's call it. I have friends, a lot of my friends I call Luddites, but they don't like that term, but they are people who believe that we have to be sure and turn off the lights when we move from one room to another. And a lot of things that I have to say I'm not into. Yeah. And they believe that you can't have economic growth because it would deplete the world's resources and so on. Anyway, one of my friends in New Zealand says, and she's going to be writing about it for Peace Magazine, I asked her to talk about controversies. And it seems that the controversy in their house is whether to get rid of their old car and buy an electric vehicle or not. And I believe it's her husband who believes that, yes, electric vehicles are obviously much better because they consume much less energy. But her argument is that creating and building an electric vehicle creates a lot of greenhouse gas. And therefore, what they should do is go ahead and wear out their old car, which is, certainly does put out greenhouse gases, wear it out before they replace it. and try to get along without using a car at all and hike, or she goes hitchhiking and so on for her means of transportation. So I think, these are, when people think that they have a personal responsibility for changing their consumption patterns, uh, or for trying to do things like live off the grid by building their house, by the way, is this passive solar house with thick walls and so on, so they don't need heating. And they're really very conscientious about it. But it does mean that people have to take on a lot more responsibility for making decisions about things like whether it's reasonable to buy a new electric vehicle now or wait a few years and wear out your old car. Do you have a position on that? Is this related to your question about austerity?
Well, there's a couple of issues there we have to deal with. One would be, yes, there's some individual responsibility, but to solve global warming has to be a big deal. A lot of commendable things individuals doing won't get us there. It's like spitting in the ocean, if I can use that. So you buy an electric vehicle, you turn out the lights. That's not even going to show up realistically. We really need to get to the point where we shut down coal-fired power plants. We use electricity, which is the cleanest form of energy, for all of our uses where that's possible. But you're not going to have an electric plane to fly across the Atlantic. And so there'll be a need for things like synthetic fuels made from hydrogen or recaptured CO2. And these are big deals. And you need to be producing power maybe in the Sahara. You need to be having a national transmission grid. And these are things that individual decisions don't even touch. So we have to do the big things right, is in my mind. And if you do the big things right, there'll be abundant energy, and it'll be affordable. It'll be clean electricity for most places, and in some cases there'll be clean jet fuel. There'll be clean hydrogen, things like that. If electricity gets cheap enough, you can produce hydrogen and use that instead of methane for a lot of applications. So we need to get the big.
What do you think about that? Tell me more about hydrogen.
Well,
20 years ago or so.
Well, let me finish one thing.
The future was always supposed to belong to hydrogen cars, for example. 20 years ago, everybody was talking about we were going to be using hydrogen cars by now, et cetera. Now, my impression is that this, for some reason, the use of hydrogen has not progressed as much as people expected it to, whereas, of course, solar and wind have. Why is this?
Well, let me get back to one thing before I forget it. Your friend, conservation and efficiency is valuable. And Craig and I say that we need to improve our energy efficiency, which is improving worldwide around 2% a year. If we could improve that at 3% a year, we save a lot of energy and a lot of greenhouse gases. So part of what we do will be better insulating our buildings, switching from incandescent lights to fluorescent to LEDs. So that's a very good way of getting us partway there. So conservation and efficiency is good. Now, if we go to hydrogen, people have been talking about the hydrogen economy for at least 50 years. That's sort of when I first read something about it. And hydrogen is a very good source of fuel, of energy. But it is, if you produce it today using natural gas, it's just another fossil fuel use, because you'd be creating CO2 to produce the hydrogen.
Oh, wait a minute. Tell me how that works. I'm a little slow on the uptake on that.
Yeah. Well, you can produce hydrogen today using a process that is based on natural gas. So you would convert natural gas into hydrogen, and a byproduct would be CO2.
I would have assumed that what you do, maybe I
Yeah.
read it.
Well,
I would
yeah.
have assumed that what you do is you take electricity and you do electrolysis of water, and then
That's
you.
and that's and that's that's green hydrogen. That would be good hydrogen if the electricity is from renewables,
Uh-huh.
not from a fossil fuel power plant. The issue there is the cost of electricity. And there'll be some, let's say there'll be some process improvements, so you'll get more hydrogen for less electricity. But when electricity gets cheap enough, you can produce hydrogen that is cost effective. And in fact, there are projects in the U.S. today where they are planning to use hydrogen as a form of energy storage. They'll produce hydrogen during the day when electricity from solar is abundant, and then burn that hydrogen at night in a turbine to produce electricity. So hydrogen's coming, and the big thing is, when will electricity be cheap enough so that you can produce hydrogen at a competitive price?
So it still is going to be an important part of the whole package.
I think it could be.
Mhm.
And hydrogen has some unique problems. It's a very light gas. It's I think it's the smallest molecule in the periodic table, so it's hydrogen leaks are a problem. But in Europe, they're even converting some pipelines to hydrogen pipelines. They're actually preparing to use hydrogen instead of methane for some applications.
Is that safe?
I think using hydrogen would be just as safe as using methane or natural gas.
Mm.
I mean, one thing there's some of the interesting things about hydrogen because of its low density. One thing is, if you had a pipeline, let's say that's 1,200 psi, pounds per square inch, for methane, you may need to have a pipeline with 3,000 psi, because you have to push to get the same energy pushed through the pipeline if you have hydrogen instead of methane, just because hydrogen would need to be compressed at a higher pressure to give you the same energy throughput.
Mhm. Mhm.
But there's nothing unique about hydrogen for fuel cells are very efficient. So there are fuel cell powered cars. And if hydrogen got cheap enough, they could be a competitor for the electric
I've
vehicle.
heard some people don't like the fuel celled hydrogen cars, if that's the word for it, as well as they like regular electric cars. Am I?
They say why?
I don't know. They just didn't feel
Yeah.
the report I had of people driving it. It felt like clunky. It's clunky to drive. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that could be easily. I mean, well, realistically, if you have a fuel cell car, it does not have a piston engine, and it runs an electric motor. So with a fuel cell car, you're getting your electricity from a fuel cell rather than a battery. But I would assume that the performance could be, maybe the early versions of fuel cell cars are a little clunky because they're Model Ts compared to some of the things they're competing with.
About 5 years ago, there was a guy named Mark Jacobson who had a proposal to um, power, was it all of California, or maybe it was the whole world? I don't know. At a certain date, he was really very ambitious about how quickly everything could be made based on renewables. He's at Stanford,
Yeah.
and we brought him here. I shouldn't say we, I didn't have anything to do with it, but I arranged a room for him to talk in. But so I don't know him really well, but he gave a talk about how to do that. And then he got home and he got clobbered. A lot of people jumped all over him saying that his figures were wrong or something like that. Do you know anything about that controversy and who's wound up being triumphant and who has had to admit that he was wrong?
Well, I don't know that specific person or that, but there have been a lot of studies. I've got two on my desk right now, one from Stanford, one from Cal Berkeley. I've read reports from Caltech, the renewable um, economies based on renewables powering the U.S. Typically, these have been dealing with the U.S. rather than the globe, but the same principles apply. And so I think that you can have a little bit of an argument of how many wind turbines you need, or how many square feet of or square miles of solar panels, and how much battery storage. But the other thing is there's a lot of computer simulations which are very good, because they can look at weather patterns and say, typically, here's what happens with solar, with wind over the day, over the year, and can predict how much storage you need, things like that. So there's a lot of very good work being done in that area, and everything I read says that it is technically feasible.
Technically feasible, but then they always say, but is it politically likely? I mean, that I think is this, I haven't read Bill Gates's book yet, but basically, he's saying what you do. Hurry up, hurry up. You're not doing it fast enough.
The book, he's done a very good job. I recommend his book. But, the thing, Meta, that I would say, because like in Texas, a lot of people saying, oh, this just shows renewables aren't good enough. You can't depend on them, things like that. We can't get rid of fossil fuels. And you and I would say, we don't have a choice. I mean, if you want to stop climate change, global warming, you have to get rid of fossil fuels. I mean, there's some other things you need to do as well, but 75 or 80% of the problem is getting rid of fossil fuels. And you have to make renewables work. And it can be done. And it's now not only technically feasible, it's increasingly economical. Now, one thing I could also mention is renewables are, a lot of countries could become energy independent based on renewables. Parts of Africa, India, let's say, things like that. So there's some interesting possibilities there.
Yeah, those are the political angles that interest me. Yeah.
But there's plenty of energy.
Okay, the question of when. I mean, I've forgotten what Mark Jacobson projected about what was realistic, but it was something quite soon, 2030 or something, and quite shocking. But what do you think is a realistic, good scenario for being really powering the world almost entirely by renewables?
Well, there's two parts to that. One, the international or the intergovernmental panel on climate change, the IPCC, said we've got to get to net zero by 2050 if we want to keep the Earth's temperature under 2 degrees centigrade, and preferably 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that's been thrown out as a goal, and that's what President Biden's saying, for instance, and that's what a lot of studies are based on. And in a way, you could say we could get there. Craig and I don't believe, we think we need to go as fast as we can, starting immediately, but we don't think we can get there in that time. Now, I don't think it's very productive to argue whether we get to net zero by 2050, 2060, 2070. We need to get there as quickly as we can, and we need to electrify the economy, produce that electricity with renewables, make other changes to agriculture and deforestation. So we are convinced that it can be done. We're skeptical that we could get there that quickly, but it doesn't hurt trying. You're not wasting your time. You're going in the right direction. My fear, I think, if I had to be afraid, is that we'll blow it, that we'll do the wrong thing. President Biden said he's going to spend $2 trillion in his first term on global warming, and if this turns into a big pork barrel project with a lot of projects that really aren't going to get us in the right direction, they don't create the right incentives. Craig and I keep saying failure is an option. We could either not move fast enough, or we could do the wrong thing, or just do a lousy job. And just one last thing. I mean, in California, we've said we want to get to all electricity produced by renewables by 2045 and get to net zero by 2050 and eliminate the sale of electric vehicle of fossil fuel, or let's say internal combustion engineering by cars by 2035. Will we get there? I look at the bullet train. It's a disaster, and then the rollout of the vaccine and a number of other, the infrastructure in the state is in very poor shape. And now we're throwing out these big objectives, and I have to say, it can be done, but will we do it?
Well, all I can do is offer all the support I can give.
Yeah.
Trying to, get people more agitated on the topic.
Well,
It's really political will. Yeah. I think. I mean, maybe we don't know enough in certain areas, but I think mostly it's that we know what to do. We're just not doing it. Right.
And I think Bill Gates' book is very good because he identifies some technical breakthroughs we need. And I certainly agree with him, but I also say there's absolutely no reason not to do it now with what we've got. Mm-hmm. And we can.
Well, okay, let's do it.
And the good news is it can be done. The question is, will we do it? And I think one of the things that I applaud your efforts, we need to educate the public so they'll support what needs to be done.
Well, you're doing it. So come back and we'll have another talk show and let's push it harder. This has been fun as usual. You take care and have a good day. All right. Bless you.
Thanks. And I appreciate your efforts too. We're certainly headed in the right direction.
Yeah. Terrific. See ya. Bye.
Bye.